My name is Joshua Brandell, and I will be interviewing Pastor Bill Harman for a project that I'm doing to research the civil rights movement in America in the 1960s. This project is for my U.S. history class, and I think Bill will be the perfect person to interview to find out more about this topic. All right. Pastor Bill, first of all, I'd like to thank you for coming here and allowing me to interview and talk to you.
I enjoy doing it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. So let's start off with, where did you grow up?
I grew up in South Bend, Indiana.
What was your community like? What kind of school did you go to?
Well, South Bend was, in relationship to what we're going to talk about, was a rather split community.
Okay.
There was the phrase, those who lived on the other side of the tracks. Guess who they were? They were the African Americans, or what we then called Negroes.
Mm-hmm.
And the Negroes all had to live in a certain area, or all did. We didn't know that they had to. So I was in a lower middle class neighborhood, but there were no African Americans.
Moving a little closer to our topic, I know it's a hard time period to define very precisely, but referring to the civil rights movement, about how old were you when that was in full swing?
I was about 21. I knew about it in high school, but not too much. I really became more aware of it in college, and then especially aware of it when I went to school in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
where there were more racial divisions and incidents. So I became more aware of it then. By then I was probably 23, 24.
And what college was that?
Went to Wittenberg University, Springfield, Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to a seminary in Chicago, Illinois. And then later I went to graduate school in Berkeley.
All right. What were your parents' views and beliefs, especially regarding the racial unrest?
My father was a total bigot. He early on would make comments like, all niggers, and I use the N word because that was common in those days. I know you're not supposed to use it now, but we're reflecting history, right? All niggers should stay in the jungle, and they all belong in trees, and they're animals. That was his view. My mother was less that way. She'd say, oh, don't listen to your father, he just has these funny ideas. But what was always interesting to me was that on the back porch of our house, I remember growing up when I was very young, sat an African-American woman in a rocking chair smoking a corncob pipe. And I recall that she was there from time to time because she would help my mother out with things, because our grandmother lived with us. My grandmother lived with us. So it was kind of interesting that it was a strange mix of prejudice and acceptance on a different level.
All right. As a child, did you have any African American friends? Did you interact with any African American people at all?
Yeah, because our school was very near to the other side of the tracks. So the African American students would show up, a few of them in our elementary school, which was just about a block away from where I was. And at Colfax Elementary School, we had maybe 10 Negro children, African American kids, and one of them was Jimmy. And I liked Jimmy, so I invited him home one day. And I thought that would be fun, have him come home with me. And so I took him up to my room, we played, we had a good time, and after he left, my mother said to me, don't tell your father what you did today. I said, why? What did I do? And she said, well, you took Jimmy into your room. I said, well, what's wrong with that? She said, well, just don't tell your father. So that was my introduction that I had done something wrong by inviting an African-American friend to my home. That was the first indication.
Mm-hmm.
I got other indications along the line, like when I went to visit my cousins in Tennessee. My uncle was the sheriff of Nashville, and he had a rural farm, and there were African-American workers on the farm. And I remember being on the back of the wagon, which was being pulled by horses in those days. And see, I'm that old. And the one of the workers said something that he shouldn't have said, and my uncle whopped him side of the head and threw him off the wagon. And I thought, that's strange. I never knew my uncle to be like that. But that was the way it was in the South in those days.
So as a white person living there, were you ever personally discriminated against?
In South Bend? No, not really.
Or at any point?
In my lifetime? Well, it was interesting. After we first went to Africa, that was the first call I had, was to teach in Africa. And there was one incident in Africa where they didn't think racially. They didn't talk about us as white people. They referred to us as Europeans, but we were obviously the minority. And I was standing in line to pay my taxes in Arusha, Tanzania, when one African guy comes up and says, "You Europeans have to be at the back of the line. You go to the end of the line." And I looked and I said, "Why?" This was all in Swahili. And I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're not one of us, you're European." And suddenly about 10 Africans in line all gathered around him and said, "Stop what you're saying. That's not right at all. He should be right where he is. You go to the end of the line." So that was one early discrimination.
So now moving more directly into it, what was your personal participation in the civil rights movement?
Well, when you say civil rights movement, if we go the whole sweep of history, we have to go all the way back.
Right.
I was always interested in history. And so I noted there were about 5 major slave rebellions between 1730 and 1865, 1860 when we had the Civil War. And so I always thought about that and concluded that obviously there was some big problem in trying to keep African Americans as slaves. I was also interested in the Haitian Rebellion, which happened between it's about 1790 and 1803. And that was the first time in history that an African country that had been enslaved by the French got their freedom. And I remember reading that frightened all the slave owners. So I had this interest in history. So when the Civil Rights Movement came along in the 1950s, I was following it kind of, because I was aware that there's something wrong that needed to be changed. And I don't know if you know it yet, but when you become a young adult, you'll become very idealistic, and you're going to change the world, right? You're going to change the world, right? Well, I was going to change the world. So I was looking for those things that would allow me to change the world and for the better. So I was looking for a calling or a vocation or a career that would do that. Then I was looking for different causes. So I was right away interested in it. Unfortunately, I was a student without much money, so I was limited as far as what I could do about civil rights. So what was your question again? What was my participation?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know it's a very broad topic, right?
So it was, first of all, interest.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, when the March to Selma came along, I heard about a friend, a pastor friend, who had gone to the first march. There were 3 marches to Selma. He had been to not the first one where they beat everybody, but the second one where they stopped at the edge of the bridge before they went to Selma. And he was trying to encourage young seminarians like I was in the seminary studying to be a pastor, that we should do something about this. Lutheran Christians should speak out on this issue. So I thought, that's right. So I went back to the seminary, all idealistic. I said, "Come on, guys." And it was all guys in those days.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Come on, we're all going to go." And then I went to administration. I said, "Come on, you got to pay our way because we don't have any money. We got to take the train all the way down to Selma." Guess what my answers were? I didn't get very many volunteers. And the seminary said, "We don't pay for things like that. What do you think of it?" So I thought, well, okay. So I talked to a few friends. One was a Canadian, and one was a Danish guy. And Danish Lutherans are very liberal in their thinking about social issues. And one was studying to be a social worker, so he had a concern for social concerns. So we got about 5 of us to go. And I talked to the pastor who was encouraging us. He took up a collection at his church, and that's what paid our fare down. So we all went down there ready to change the world. That was my first involvement.
How does your religion play into all of this? How does that affect?
The civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was a coalition of faith groups. It was, first of all, Christian. Martin Luther King was Christian. He was a pastor, Baptist pastor. Secondly, it was Jewish people, because Jews were discriminated against in that time period too. There had been the lynching of a Jew in the South at about the same time in the 1950s. And the other Protestant groups, as well as Catholic orders, like orders of nuns and priests. They all united in the civil rights movement, and that's what really gave them the crowd. The majority of people who marched were from religious organizations. The slave rebellions were violent. The Civil War was violent. For the first time, there was an attempt to have a civil rights movement that was nonviolent, and that also attracted me. Because some of us believe that violence never achieves much, but nonviolence can change things, as it changed India with Mahatma Gandhi, and as it changed the U.S. in the civil rights movement. What really got us going was when they killed a pastor who'd been down there for civil rights. And it was interesting because not much was said when all the black people in Selma were agitating for the right to register to vote. When some of them were killed, you never saw it on the front page of the New York Times. But when one white pastor was killed, that made the headlines. And reflects the racism of the time, and probably reflects current racism too. We still favor whites. And so that really got us. We thought, gosh, they're killing pastors. We got to do something about this. That has to change. And that's what roused us even more. But to be nonviolent, and we had to be trained in that because it's not easy to be nonviolent. If you want to know more about nonviolence, I can describe to you what would really get me mad and almost made me violent when we were marching from Selma to Montgomery. You want to hear that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, the young white men in the South were very angry that we were coming down. We wore our clerical collars to show that we were clergy. We thought that kind of protected us a little bit. Obviously, we found out it didn't much because they killed the guy with a white collar on. So on the train going down, as soon as we crossed the Mason-Dixon line, which is the line that then divided the South from the North, on the train, some big white guy stands, when I was going to go to the bathroom, stands in the aisle and stands in front of me, and he was huge, and I was not that big, and says, "Where do you think you're going?" And I gulped and said, to Selma. "What do you think you're going to be doing there? Are you trying to change something?" I said, "Well, we hope so." And then a few friends of mine said, or a few friends of his, I think, said, "Oh, leave him alone. He's too dumb to understand what's happening in the South." So that was a little bit frightening. But I had to stay nonviolent, right? I wanted to kick him or something, but I didn't. Then when we get down there, we're all trained in nonviolence, how to roll up in a ball if they start hitting you, if they start hosing you, and all that kind of stuff. And we had different camps along the route line. That's where Joan Baez was singing, Harry Belafonte was down there singing, Bob Dylan. So we got to hear all these entertainers. And then we were organized to do the march. And as we got into town, the FBI was filming because at that time they thought the civil rights movement was a communist movement. Martin Luther King was dubbed by J. Edgar Hoover as a communist. And they were following all of us, so they were filming us. But we had National Guard on our side, so there were helicopters and all the National Guard people. But along the route, the march route, were all these young white guys who didn't want us there. So they'd shout things at us. "Nigger lover. What in the world are you doing down here?" And all kinds of stuff. And then one of their favorite things to do was to spit. And could those guys ever spit? You wouldn't believe how far spit can carry, especially if you're a southern white guy in the 1960s. These guys would spit right in your face, and you had to keep marching. Now, wouldn't that make you angry to be spit in the face? What was your natural, inclination to do? What are you gonna do? Well, we had to resist that, and so I would just turn to everybody who spit in my face and say, smile and say, "Thank you." That enraged them. They couldn't stand. That's what the power of nonviolence is all about. You kill them with love, and they don't know what to do with that. They'd know what to do if I gave them the finger, or if I threw something at them. That they'd understand. But nobody understands quite the power of nonviolent love.
Did your parents and your family know about your participation in the march?
No. I learned not to tell my father these things. He would not be able to understand that.
Yeah. So, on a broader scope, I guess, what do you think are some of the most important takeaways from the entire movement, from that whole period of time?
For me or for the whole world?
Well, let's start with for you.
Okay. Sorry.
It might be easier to answer.
Listening to Martin Luther King asking the question, how long are we going to have to be pleading for the rights of a human being to be free of all these discriminations? That was a very powerful moment. I always remember that. I remember the thing that happened when I got back, because I had been, you're required in seminary to teach a class every week in a church as part of your training. And I had what we call a confirmation class of all young teenagers. And I had about 30 in my class. And I went off for the march, and when I came back, guess how many I had in my class? 5. All the rest of the parents had concluded they did not want their child taught by a communist. That was how strong, and this was in a suburb of Chicago, that's how strong the anti-communism was and the association of it with the civil rights movement. So that was an interesting takeaway, that I was aware that when you're doing something that is important and that is correct in your eyes and that you feel is just, there's going to be a lot of people who aren't going to agree with you. And you have to accept that. You have to be ready for the criticism that comes.
This is more of an abstract question, but do you think the civil rights movement was successful?
Any movement that attempts to change the hearts of people is going to take a lifetime. And one of my learnings is, if you set out to do something to change the hearts and minds of people and to move the arc of justice forward, it's a lifelong struggle. And you aren't going to see a success. And you're probably going to have to do it 2 or 3 times. So that's my feeling about the civil rights movement. Yes, we had successes. The March to Montgomery, in those days, that was huge. 25,000 people in one way for one purpose, to oppose Southern culture and discrimination. That was huge. But we know now there are marches for Black Lives Matter. How many years later? 50, 60 years later. So it's still going on. So we have to continuously affirm what we know to be right, and we have to be confident that we're right. And you get that confidence, I think, from a deep spiritual place, and otherwise you burn out. If you think you're going to achieve something and everyone's going to write a story about you or put it in the headlines, that's not how it works. Martin Luther King got the headlines, but he also got assassinated. So, yeah, I think there's been lots of successes, but it's not yet a success. We're still working at it.
Yeah.
You're going to work at it, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
How did you hear about the assassination of Martin Luther King?
It was really odd. I was in Tanzania in my first task as a pastor, teaching in a seminary. And we got the news that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. And they showed the images of all the fires and all the riots and everything that were going on, and we thought all the cities were being burned down. From our perspective, how many thousands of miles away in East Africa. And then the students came up to me and said, why would they kill Martin Luther King? He was a good man. And I had to try to answer that to Africans who could not understand our social situation. So it wasn't something unexpected. There had been lots of plots and threats and everything, so that was a risk that you'd take as a leader like that. But then he was the second person to be assassinated after John Kennedy, a famous person. So that was the one that really shocked, was President Kennedy's killing. But we began to adjust that this can happen. So when Martin Luther King was killed, we were aware that, yeah, it can happen again. And then shortly after that, Bobby Kennedy was killed. And again, I was still in Africa, so the students came out and said, why are you killing all the people who try to help black people? And I said, well, I don't know. How do you answer that to an African? It's very difficult. And it's too bad. But that's the risk you take if you set out to do something good.
And can you tell me a little bit more about the assassination of John F. Kennedy?
Well, I was at that time in San Diego doing a year of internship, they call it. Like a doctor does a year of internship. Mm-hmm. Pastors have to do a year of internship. And I heard it on the radio, and I couldn't believe it. I just said, we'd never experienced anything like that in our lifetime. You just didn't do that to presidents. And so it was really a shock. And I'd say it extinguished the hopeful views that we at that age, I was about, 21 then, that we had of the future. We thought things were going to move in a positive direction, and it wasn't. So that was a tough one.
Is there anything else you would like to add about how you feel about the movement, or anything I haven't asked you about that might be pertinent?
Well, part of my involvement also was working with the Black Panthers, and since this is their 50th anniversary year, I think they deserve some credit.
Can you just briefly describe what that is?
I was up in Marin County in graduate school, and the Black Panther movement out of Oakland was mainly a social organization that attempted to help black people in their neighborhoods. Yeah, they really early on were saying Black Lives Matter, and they were trying to protect blacks from being arrested in the wrong way or shot when they were arrested. So they used a loophole, not a loophole. It was in California at that time, they had the right to carry law. You could carry a weapon without concealing it. And so they did that. They went with weapons, and if they heard that a black person was being harassed by the police in Oakland, they'd go and surround the scene with their weapons, and that intimidated the police. Some say that was not a good tactic, but it made the point. And they also had social moves. They were feeding black children in the schools. They were educating them in the awareness of their black history. And so since I had just come back from Africa at that point in time, I was a pastor at that time. And I was in a church in San Rafael, California. Marin City was a city where we were attempting to integrate both blacks and whites in one place. And I was part of that action. And so they knew me from that. And I was also speaking Swahili and teaching Swahili to students in a high school.
So you've been all over, right? Ohio, Chicago, Indiana, where you're from, San Francisco, Tanzania.
Yeah.
Do you feel like in all of those places you could connect a purpose that you had in all of those places?
Yeah, because if you get a concept or a goal for life, like you want to see justice done, you want to see a better world, you want to make life better for people, you want to help people. If you put all that into a package, you can do that in any occupation you take. Some occupations, lend themselves to it better than others, but I just happen to be really fortunate that I got into an occupation or a career or a calling, which allowed me to do a lot of different things. So not only could I be a teacher, but I could be a pastor. I could also be an administrator. I could be a project developer, so I did that in the Caribbean. I developed projects with poor churches and groups in the Caribbean region. Then I'd go up to New York City and ask for money. And then I did the same thing in Geneva, Switzerland, and I did it internationally. And that got me into the anti-apartheid movement, because we had a task force up in Geneva of the World Council of Churches that worked with Archbishop Tutu and others in South Africa to oppose apartheid. So that was great, because it's the same purpose, the same goal on a wider scale, to oppose apartheid. And just think, not only did civil rights make progress in the U.S., but the apartheid movement ended. Mm-hmm. The wall came down in Berlin. A woman is running for president. We elected a black president. From my standpoint of where the world was then, when I started out at your age, that's huge.
Absolutely.
And then you get a certain sense that, gosh, I had a part of that. I was part of that. And that's what gives you satisfaction, even though you don't see it totally perfect yet. But you keep on keeping on.
Yeah, it's great to see that progress made however many decades ago can be affecting our presidential elections in this decade, right?
Yeah, it certainly is. Yeah. So that's the real point of you studying the civil rights movement is to get your own self-motivation for what you're going to do to change the world and make the world a better place. I was glad that I marched from Selma to Montgomery, and I'm glad that I opposed the things I've opposed over the years, like the Vietnam War. That was another thing that I'd say I got into some difficulty on, because I refused to pay my taxes when I was living in Marin County, because in those days they were taxing your phone bill in order to pay for the Vietnam War. And I was opposed to the Vietnam War, so I joined others and refused to pay my phone tax. And then they threatened to cut off the service. But we had so many of us, if they cut off our service, they'd lose money. So, but that put us on an FBI list. So I have a nice FBI file that I want to see someday.
Do you think there could be another civil rights movement in this country on such a scale?
Probably not, but Black Lives Matter is a good movement within it. But I think there has to be a bigger movement that involves transforming the global economy and the national economy and dealing with the issue of income inequality. And maybe that's your generations. Over to you. Do something about that, because Martin Luther King was right. After he advocated for civil rights, he also advocated for an end of the Vietnam War. He advocated for transformation of the economy. And there are movements that do that. I'm involved with the Jubilee USA, which is a movement attempting to transform the global economy to work better for the poorest countries of the world. So we're trying to get tax laws changed and other things that we have to lobby for, and also debt issues, because one of the tricks of banks is to get nations and poor people in debt. And poor people are exploited by these weak paychecks, places you can go to, and they charge them 350% interest. The student loan issue, you get a student loan and you're going to pay back the student loan in the first couple of years, but they're going to keep on collecting interest for the next 10 years. So that's exploitation. And these are injustices. These are economic injustices that need to be changed. And they're complex. You have to spend at least a lifetime. And you run up against great powers that are going to oppose you all the way down the line, especially when it comes to changing the economy. So I say feel the burn, because Bernie Sanders is right about what he's saying. I'm not sure he's going to be able to accomplish all that, but I think he's on the right track for getting that out there. And maybe your generation has to pick that up and make it a really big movement. Do some march. Don't be afraid to march, because people pay attention to marches for whatever reason. I don't know exactly why, but if you get 100,000 people on the mall in Washington, D.C., people pay attention.
Well, I guess that concludes our interview.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it. Yeah. Let's do it again sometime. After about 10 years, maybe, after I work in my cause of transforming the global economy, and you've begun to challenge income inequality, we can come back together again and see what we accomplished.
Sounds like a plan.
Sounds like a plan.
I think it's really important to use all of the resources we have today in order to understand our history, because as much as we can read a textbook or a history book, the only way we can kind of really fully understand the scope and depth of historical events is by talking to the people who participated in them. And so I feel like Pastor Bill was perfect for that, and I was able to understand from one person's perspective rather than a history book trying to encompass everybody's perspective on it. I could see an individual's thinking and experiences from the civil rights movement. So that was very valuable to me.